The room was alive with chatter, the kind of low, constant hum that filled every military briefing before a high-stakes operation. Maps flickered on screens, digital markers glowing over hostile terrain. The men at the table leaned forward, exchanging quick glances and clipped sentences, tossing around acronyms and coordinates as if they were speaking a secret language only they understood. Every chair was filled, every rank visible on their shoulders, except one. She stood near the back, half in the shadows, her uniform pressed, her notepad clutched to her chest, waiting for someone to acknowledge her presence. No one did. When she finally moved closer to the table, the conversation didn't pause. One officer glanced her way, not with curiosity but with dismissal, as though her being there was an administrative error. She tried to speak, her voice steady but low, yet her words were drowned out by louder tones, stronger egos, voices used to being obeyed. It wasn't the first time this had happened. She had been in rooms like this before, rooms that smelled of old coffee and confidence, rooms where silence was her only weapon. They didn't know her history, not the real one. To them, she was a late addition to the roster, a transfer from some forgotten branch, maybe someone with connections who'd found her way into the room by accident. The whispers confirmed it. Two officers near the far end exchanged smirks when she pulled out her notes. Another leaned toward his comrade, muttering under his breath about babysitting civilians. She heard it all, but she didn't flinch. She had learned long ago that people who underestimated her revealed more than they realized. Every careless comment, every dismissive glance, they were tells, pieces of a puzzle she could use later. The Admiral hadn't arrived yet. His absence gave the others permission to talk freely, to make assumptions. A senior officer began the preliminary briefing, his voice booming with authority, his pointer tapping the map as he outlined enemy fortifications and escape vectors. She watched in silence, her eyes tracing the grid lines on the display. She noticed things, inconsistencies in the data, misaligned coordinates, details that didn't match the last intelligence drop she'd reviewed the night before. She wanted to speak up, to correct the error that could compromise the mission, but experience told her that now wasn't the time. Her mind moved faster than her pulse. She began making mental notes, aligning the data in her head, calculating probable enemy movements. Her analytical skills were her greatest strength, the very reason she'd been recruited for operations beyond the reach of standard clearance. Yet here she was, treated like an intern among warriors. She could feel the weight of their judgment pressing on her from all sides, but she refused to let it break her focus. The mission mattered more than pride. When the door finally opened, the atmosphere shifted. The SEAL Admiral walked in without a word, his expression unreadable. The chatter stopped instantly. Every officer straightened in their seat, and she instinctively stepped aside, her presence still unnoticed. The Admiral's eyes swept the room, pausing briefly on her before moving on. He took his seat at the head of the table, opened the folder in front of him, and began reviewing the reports. The briefing continued, now under his silent supervision. Voices grew more measured, more cautious. Still, no one invited her input. One lieutenant even gestured toward her chair, the one she hadn't taken, as if reminding her of her place. She remained standing. There was something about the Admiral's demeanor that kept her still. He hadn't said her name yet, hadn't addressed her role, but she knew he was aware of it. He had to be. Someone like him didn't allow unknowns into his briefing room. As the officers presented their data, she caught another error. This one was worse. It meant the recon team was relying on a satellite feed that hadn't updated in 72 hours. She bit her lip. The urge to speak grew stronger. Every second that passed increased the risk of sending good soldiers into a trap. She turned a page in her notebook and wrote a single phrase. Wrong coordinates, confirm source. Her handwriting was firm, deliberate. No one asked for her notes. No one even looked her way. She was invisible again. And yet, deep down, she knew she wouldn't stay invisible for long. Somewhere behind those unreadable eyes, the Admiral was watching. She caught him glancing at her notebook once, just long enough to know that he'd seen it. The smallest flicker of recognition passed across his face before he returned to the discussion. The men around her continued, oblivious to the quiet storm building beside them. They didn't know that the one they ignored had already seen the flaw in their plan, that she was the only one in the room capable of saving their mission before it began. She didn't need their approval or their attention. All she needed was the moment when the truth would force them to listen. The SEAL Admiral sat at the head of the table, his presence filling the room without the need for words. He didn't command attention with volume. He didn't have to. His silence carried more authority than any shout could. The officers around him adjusted in their seats, lowering their voices, straightening their posture. Even the screens dimmed slightly as though the room itself knew who had entered. He placed a thick folder on the polished surface in front of him, its corners worn, its edges marked with faint smudges of fingerprints. No one dared to ask what was inside. From her place near the wall, she studied him carefully. His reputation preceded him, a man who had led operations no one dared to name, a strategist whose decisions had shaped missions that didn't exist on paper. His face was unreadable, carved from years of discipline and loss. There was a weight in his stillness, something deliberate, like a man waiting to see who would speak first and who would expose themselves through impatience. She knew that kind of silence. She had been trained to recognize it. It wasn't the quiet of disinterest, it was the quiet of calculation. The officers continued presenting the mission data, one after another. The Admiral didn't interrupt. His eyes moved from the maps to the reports, to the faces of the men who spoke. He nodded occasionally, but said almost nothing. The tension was subtle at first, the kind that only those attuned to hierarchy could sense. A single glance from him was enough to change the energy of the room. The men spoke faster, less certain, checking their notes twice before continuing. She stood at the edge of the table now, her back straight, her notebook open, pretending to jot down information she already knew. She could feel his gaze shift briefly toward her, almost like a test. It wasn't a glance of curiosity. It was as if he was measuring her reaction, searching for something behind her calm exterior. She kept her expression neutral, her breathing controlled. If he was testing her composure, she wouldn't fail it. The room smelled faintly of cold metal and coffee gone stale. Every detail felt amplified, the ticking of the clock, the soft rustle of papers, the muted hum of the air vents. The Admiral's hand rested near the folder, but he didn't open it. His knuckles brushed against the embossed red label across the top, classified, Level 5 access. No one asked about it, but everyone noticed. It sat there like a secret waiting to be spoken aloud. He leaned back in his chair, eyes narrowing slightly as another officer projected a satellite feed on the screen. Terrain outlines flickered, accompanied by coordinates and timestamps. She watched as the feed glitched briefly, and her instincts tensed. The data was still outdated. The error remained. She waited for someone else to notice it, to correct it. No one did. The Admiral's fingers tapped lightly on the folder, once, twice, and then stopped. He didn't speak, but his silence said enough. It was the kind of pause that made everyone wonder what he already knew. One of the younger officers attempted to recover, offering alternate extraction routes, his voice trembling under the pressure. The Admiral didn't respond. He simply turned his head slightly toward her direction. It wasn't enough to draw attention from the others, but she caught it. That tiny gesture, deliberate, precise, told her everything. He wasn't ignoring her. He knew. Somehow, he knew exactly who she was, and he was waiting for the right moment to reveal it. She could feel her pulse quicken, not from fear, but from recognition. The Admiral's silence wasn't disinterest, it was preparation. He was watching the team fail to see what she already understood. He was letting them talk, letting them make their assumptions, letting the illusion of control continue just long enough to make its collapse meaningful. It was a kind of psychological discipline few possessed, the ability to say nothing until the truth carried its own voice. The officers didn't notice how often his gaze drifted toward her. They were too focused on the maps, on their own words, on their need to impress. She stood still, absorbing every moment, realizing that the Admiral's restraint was intentional. It was like he was silently acknowledging her presence without giving it away. There was respect in that, even protection. In a room full of decorated egos, he was the only one who saw beyond rank. He shifted slightly, opening a different folder, a thinner one this time, and skimmed through the top page. Then he stopped. His eyes lingered on something written there. He closed it again, calmly, and placed it beside the thicker classified file. The gesture was small, almost invisible, but she caught the pattern. It was the same technique used in high-level briefings to reference a secondary subject without disclosing it publicly. She realized then that the file with her name on it wasn't forgotten somewhere in storage. It was right in front of him. The Admiral finally spoke, his voice quiet, steady, the kind that silenced even the hum of the projectors. He asked a single question about a recon detail, a question that none of the men could answer with certainty. She knew the answer instantly. Her lips parted slightly, but before she could speak, his eyes met hers. The look he gave her wasn't permission, it was confirmation. He already knew she had the information. He already knew everything. The folder sat between the Admiral's hands, its surface worn and marked by years of use. The red classified stamp glared beneath the fluorescent lights, its ink slightly faded but still sharp enough to command attention. The room had grown quieter with each passing minute, tension thick enough to slow the air. No one spoke now. Every officer, every strategist, every operative in that room was waiting for the Admiral to say something, anything. Instead, he simply rested his fingertips on the file and stared at it, as if weighing the cost of opening it in front of them all. The faint buzz of the projector was the only sound. The digital map on the wall flickered once before stabilizing, a cluster of coordinates glowing in red. The officers exchanged uncertain glances. She stood near the far end of the table, notebook still open, her hand frozen mid-sentence. She knew that file was hers before it even opened. There was a strange, cold recognition that rippled through her, the kind that came not from surprise, but from inevitability. The Admiral exhaled slowly, the kind of breath that carried history. Then, with deliberate precision, he slid the folder toward the center of the table and undid the metal clasp. The sound, a faint metallic click, echoed like a gun being cocked. Papers rustled. A few of the men leaned forward instinctively, curiosity battling caution. No one dared to speak. The Admiral flipped through the first few pages, eyes scanning lines of text that none of them were cleared to see. The classified seals, the blacked-out sections, the official insignias, they painted a story far more dangerous than any of them expected. Then he stopped. His hand paused on one particular page, his expression unchanged but his silence heavier. Slowly, he turned the file toward the others so they could see the header. Her name was printed in bold across the top. Beneath it, a long string of numbers and letters, operation codes that none of them recognized. The Admiral didn't say her name aloud. He didn't need to. The effect was immediate. Chairs shifted. Someone cleared his throat too loudly. The disbelief spread like wildfire across the room. Every officer who had ignored her minutes earlier now stared as though seeing her for the first time. They scanned the page in front of them, trying to decipher the meaning behind the classified operations listed under her profile. Most of the lines were redacted, but what remained was enough to silence any doubt. Phrases like deep cover, joint recon authorization, and confirmed neutralization stood out even through the black bars. The further they read, the more their faces changed, skepticism melting into something close to unease. The Admiral didn't explain. He didn't have to. The file spoke for itself. Years of covert missions, intelligence recoveries, and names of targets she'd identified, all recorded, all sealed. It wasn't the record of a newcomer. It was the record of someone who had been there long before them, someone who had operated in places they only studied in reports. She didn't move, didn't even blink. Her pulse quickened, but her face remained unreadable. The weight of her past, once buried behind classified walls, now filled the entire room. Every whispered insult, every dismissive glance from earlier, now hung in the air like ghosts. She had been invisible by design, erased by necessity, and now that veil had been lifted by the one man who had the authority to reveal it. The Admiral flipped another page, revealing a photo, a grainy image taken years earlier in a desert outpost. The woman in the picture wore the same calm expression she did now, but her uniform bore no insignia, no nameplate, only a shadowed figure standing beside a wrecked convoy. There were notes scrawled beneath it, coordinates, timestamps, and the word extraction, successful. The officers exchanged glances again, realizing what it meant. The operation had been classified as lost. None of them knew it had ever succeeded. The Admiral's gaze lingered on her, his expression still calm, but with a trace of something unspoken, respect, perhaps, or memory. He turned the folder back toward himself and closed it, resting his hand on top. The sound of the clasp locking again was like the end of a drumbeat. He looked around the room, eyes moving from one officer to another, ensuring the message had settled where it needed to. No one dared meet his gaze directly. She stood straighter now, though she hadn't moved a single step. For the first time, the men around her didn't see an outsider or a subordinate. They saw the ghost of missions they'd only heard rumors about, the operator whose name appeared in restricted files, the one who had done the impossible and survived without recognition. The classified file had rewritten her place in that room without her saying a single word. The silence stretched on, thick and electric. The Admiral finally leaned back in his chair, folding his hands before him. The folder remained between them all, a symbol, a revelation, a reminder. She could feel every pair of eyes on her now, the same eyes that had once looked past her. Only one man had known who she truly was, and he had just decided to let the truth speak louder than introductions ever could. The air in the briefing room felt heavier now, as if the walls themselves were absorbing the weight of what had just been revealed. The file lay open on the table, her name still visible at the top of the page, the faint hum of the projector filling the silence that no one dared to break. Every man in the room sat straighter, the earlier arrogance drained from their expressions. The atmosphere had shifted from casual confidence to quiet disbelief. They were looking at her differently now, not as an outsider, not as a last-minute addition, but as a mystery suddenly pulled from the shadows. The Admiral's eyes didn't leave her. His composure was unchanged, but there was something sharper in his gaze now, something that hinted at long-buried knowledge. He reached out and flipped to another section of the file, his gloved fingers tracing over the stamped seals and coded language that filled the page. She recognized the operation code names immediately. Echo Mirage, Sentinel Burn, Operation Veil Point. Each one was a mission that never officially existed, tasks buried so deep that even mentioning them required high-level clearance. As the officers leaned in, they began to realize what they were looking at. The woman they had ignored during the first half of the briefing had been part of some of the most classified operations in modern naval history. One by one, they glanced between the file and her face, trying to reconcile the quiet figure standing before them with the impossible reports written under her name. She remained still, her expression neutral, her breathing slow. It wasn't pride that held her steady. It was discipline, the kind built from years of silence, from knowing that the truth could never be spoken aloud. The Admiral turned another page, and a photo slipped loose from the file, landing face-up on the table. The image was grainy, black and white, clearly taken from a drone's surveillance feed. In it, a convoy burned beneath a fractured desert sky, and a single figure moved through the wreckage carrying a wounded soldier over her shoulder. Her face wasn't visible, but her stance, her movement, the precision in her steps, it was enough. The Admiral paused, letting the image sit there, letting it say what words could not. The room was silent except for the faint crackle of static from the projector. She could feel the tension shift around her. These men, decorated and seasoned, now looked uneasy. Not because they doubted the authenticity of the file, but because they understood what it meant. Her record was not just impressive, it was protected by classification that surpassed their own. That kind of clearance didn't come with a standard career path. It came with secrecy, sacrifice, and missions that never reached the news or the medal lists. They knew now that whatever she had done, it wasn't meant to be public. The Admiral spoke, his tone calm but deliberate, explaining none of the details, only confirming that the record was genuine. He read a single line from one of the declassified summaries, an operation log dated 3 years earlier. Operative extracted 4 hostages under heavy fire. Mission failure reclassified as success. Operative identity sealed by order of command. That was all. He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. The room understood. She stood still, memories flickering behind her eyes. The dust, the smell of gunpowder, the echo of rotor blades in the distance. None of it belonged here, in this bright, sterile room with its polished floors and ordered maps. She had left that world behind, or at least tried to. But now it was back, exposed in black ink and stamped signatures. Every detail that was supposed to stay hidden was now in front of people who were never meant to see it. The Admiral closed the folder halfway, resting his hand on it as if to signal that the revelation was complete. But even that partial glimpse of her past was enough to alter everything. The officers who had once ignored her now shifted in their seats, unsure whether to look at her or avoid her entirely. One of them muttered something under his breath, the words lost in the heavy air. Another began to reach for his notes, pretending to study them just to avoid meeting her eyes. She kept her posture firm, refusing to let the unease in the room touch her. This was not the first time her record had spoken for her. She had spent years building a career that couldn't be acknowledged, training in units that didn't officially exist, taking orders that were never written down. Recognition had never mattered. But now, in this moment, the truth had done something she never could. It had silenced every doubt, every smirk, every quiet dismissal. The Admiral's voice cut through the stillness again, low and steady. He mentioned her current assignment, something brief, only a few words, but those words were enough to suggest that her expertise wasn't an accident. She was there for a reason. She was part of the mission not because of formality or oversight, but because command had handpicked her. The same command that authorized those blacked-out pages. The same command that trusted her with operations the rest of them couldn't imagine. No one spoke after that. The only sound came from the faint rustle of the folder as the Admiral adjusted it back into place. The image of the burning convoy still lay on the table, a quiet reminder of what she'd done and what she'd survived. Every man in that room now knew that the person they had overlooked wasn't just qualified. She was beyond their clearance, beyond their understanding, someone forged in a level of operation they could only read about in fragments. The silence after the file was closed felt endless, stretching through the room like a current no one could escape. The air was charged with realization, with the weight of every assumption that had just been shattered. For the first time since the briefing began, no one moved, no one dared to speak. The woman they had ignored was no longer invisible. The classified file had done more than reveal her identity. It had rewritten the entire balance of the room. And the Admiral, calm and unshaken, had made sure everyone understood it. He looked around the table, his gaze sharp and deliberate, pausing briefly on each officer as if assessing whether they grasped the gravity of what had been shown. None of them spoke. Some stared at the file, others at their notes, pretending to reorient themselves, but all of them were waiting. Waiting for the Admiral's next order, waiting to see what her role would be now that her past had been uncovered. The projector light flickered once, and the map on the wall came back into focus. Coordinates glowed across the terrain, enemy routes, supply paths, extraction points. It was the same data they had been discussing before, but now, it felt different. Every man in the room understood that whatever plan they had built was about to change. The Admiral reached for a laser pointer, its red, sliding across the map with slow precision. His tone remained calm, but every word carried a quiet authority that silenced even the faint hum of the air vents. He began reviewing the mission parameters, his sentences clipped, his language precise. There was no room for ego now. Every decision, every movement would depend on coordination and execution. He stopped mid-sentence, turned toward her, and then, for the first time since she'd entered the room, he spoke her name aloud. It was like a code being activated, unlocking the silence that had surrounded her. The officers turned their heads toward her instinctively, their eyes following the Admiral's lead. She didn't hesitate. She stepped forward, calm and composed, the same way she had walked through countless unknown zones in the past. The Admiral gestured toward the tactical display, inviting her into the conversation. It wasn't a request. It was a directive. She placed her notebook on the table and studied the map with quick, trained eyes. Within seconds, she noticed the same errors that had bothered her earlier: misaligned coordinates, outdated reconnaissance data, blind zones that could cost lives if not corrected. Her voice was clear when she spoke, measured and unshaken. She corrected the first error, tracing her finger across the map, explaining that the satellite feed they were relying on was 72 hours old. She marked the correct route, citing the backup reconnaissance reports she had already cross-referenced. Her tone didn't waver. She didn't try to impress anyone. She simply spoke the truth, the kind of truth that only someone who had lived the consequences of bad intel could recognize immediately. The room shifted again. The officers listened. No one interrupted her now. The same men who had dismissed her minutes earlier were scribbling notes, following her analysis, nodding in quiet agreement. The Admiral watched without expression, but she could feel his silent approval. He had known this would happen, that once she began to speak, her experience would do what the file alone could not. Authority wasn't something she demanded. It was something that emanated naturally from how she carried herself, how she saw what others missed. She finished reviewing the map and stepped back, waiting for the Admiral's acknowledgement. He gave a single nod, small but deliberate, and then turned to the rest of the room. His next words came out firm, decisive. He ordered that all tactical adjustments be made according to her revisions. There was no hesitation, no discussion. The message was clear, her judgment was final. The mission, from that point forward, would move under her lead. The reaction was instant but restrained. A few officers exchanged quick glances, surprised but careful not to show defiance. They were trained men, used to hierarchy, and the Admiral's authority left no room for argument. But beneath the surface, something else was happening. Respect, quiet, reluctant at first, but undeniable, began to take root. The shift was visible in how they looked at her now, not with skepticism, but with the realization that they were standing beside someone who had earned her place in ways none of them could match. She didn't seek validation from their eyes. She simply nodded, accepting the Admiral's directive without any visible reaction. Inside, she felt the familiar weight of leadership settling over her shoulders, a weight she knew well. This wasn't new to her. The difference now was that, for the first time in a long time, her authority wasn't hidden behind classified walls. The Admiral had pulled her into the light, and now there was no going back. The briefing continued with a new rhythm. Questions were directed toward her, not out of protocol, but out of necessity. She answered each one with clarity, her focus unbroken. The Admiral rarely interrupted, allowing her to take the lead fully. The men who once questioned her presence were now relying on her insight to refine every aspect of their plan. It was an unspoken acknowledgement, one that carried more value than any apology. As the final maps were updated, the Admiral leaned back, his expression as composed as ever. His silence no longer felt distant. It felt intentional, almost proud. He had known exactly what he was doing when he revealed that file. He had known that the mission's success would depend on the woman no one had noticed at first. And now, as the team followed her lead without question, it was clear that the decision had already changed the course of everything that would follow. The mission briefing room felt different now, quieter but heavier, charged with an awareness that hadn't been there before. The Admiral's orders had reshaped everything. The map, the strategy, the hierarchy, all of it had shifted in the span of a few minutes. The woman who had stood unnoticed at the back of the room was now the focal point of every plan, every calculation, every set of eyes. Her file had not only changed the perception of who she was, but had altered the course of the mission itself. The team's survival, their success, and their future depended on the precision of her leadership. The Admiral closed the file and slid it aside, leaving only the map between them. His silence said more than any speech could. Everyone in the room understood what that silence meant. Command decisions were final, and this one was absolute. The mission was hers now. No one questioned it. No one dared to. The Admiral gave her a small nod, the kind of gesture that carried both trust and responsibility. She returned it with a single glance, controlled and calm. She didn't need words. She had been in this position before, the moment where everything depended on choices that couldn't be undone. She stepped forward, her shadow falling across the glowing terrain map projected on the table. The terrain was rough, high ridges, unstable valleys, dense forest cover leading into enemy territory. The kind of operation that allowed for no mistakes. Every movement had to be timed perfectly. Every decision had to anticipate the unseen. She traced her finger along the extraction path, her mind already reconstructing the entire mission sequence. She analyzed the terrain, recalculated infiltration times, and adjusted the coordinates where she knew the enemy would least expect movement. The officers around her watched, some still adjusting to the new reality, others silently grateful that someone so precise was in charge. Her tone was steady when she began to issue commands. She didn't hesitate or look for approval. She assigned roles, reassigned routes, and redrew the mission grid in minutes. Every order came from memory and experience, shaped by instinct more than protocol. She knew what needed to be done because she had lived through operations like this before, where one wrong turn meant no return. The Admiral remained silent, but his eyes followed every movement. He knew exactly what she was doing. He had seen her work before, in places no one else in that room had ever set foot. The younger officers began to recognize it too, the ease with which she took control, the confidence that came from surviving the kind of missions they had only read about. Her leadership wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It was quiet, efficient, unshakable. Minutes turned into hours as the plan evolved. The room had become a machine of focus and precision. Even the officers who had doubted her earlier were now leaning in, their pens moving quickly, their eyes fixed on her every mark on the map. She coordinated communication frequencies, adjusted drone flight patterns, and reviewed backup extraction points. Nothing escaped her attention. She caught mistakes before they became problems. She noticed patterns others missed. And through it all, her tone never wavered. Outside, the sky had begun to fade toward dusk, the light slipping through the blinds in narrow stripes across the room. The Admiral finally stood, his uniform catching the fading light, and walked toward her. He placed one hand on the edge of the table, his gaze steady on the map. Then, for the first time that day, he spoke directly to her in a voice that carried quiet authority. His words were few, but the meaning was unmistakable. The mission's outcome, the lives of every man in that room, rested in her hands. She nodded once, the gesture deliberate and certain. There was no fear in her expression, only focus. She understood what the Admiral meant, understood what was at stake. The operation ahead was complex, but not unfamiliar. The kind of challenge she had been trained for, the kind that tested every part of her judgment, skill, and control. She had faced worse. She had led teams through chaos and come back from places where no one else survived. This mission, like all the others, would be won through precision, not chance. The Admiral stepped back, folding his arms, letting her take the lead entirely. It was a silent transfer of command, one that needed no ceremony. The rest of the team followed her now without hesitation. They no longer saw her as an outsider. They saw her as the center of the plan, the one who could see what others couldn't. She gave the final overview, assigning checkpoints, designating communication relays, and confirming synchronized timing for deployment. Her words were sharp, efficient, leaving no room for uncertainty. As the final minutes of the briefing ticked away, the room fell into stillness again. The plan was ready. The team was prepared. Every detail, every route, every contingency was now built under her command. The Admiral's file had been the spark that revealed who she truly was, but it was her clarity and resolve that secured their trust. She stood before them, steady and silent, her expression composed. The men who had once doubted her now looked at her as the only person capable of leading them through what awaited beyond that map, beyond the briefing room walls, into the unknown terrain that would test them all.